The serene sanctuary. My name is Alex, and for years, my small slice of paradise was exactly that. The property was a dream I'd worked my entire life for. A rustic cabin on a 1-acre lot that backed onto a serene, wooded area. But the true heart of the place, the feature that made it priceless, wasn't the house itself. It was the creek. It wasn't grand or mighty, just a gentle, spring-fed stream that traced the edge of my land. Its soft babbling was the soundtrack to my mornings. My dog would splash in its shallow pools, and the wildlife, from songbirds to the occasional deer, depended on it. That creek was a living, breathing part of my home. I'd even built a simple stone bench under an old willow tree, just to sit and listen to it after a long day. It was peace. It was sanctuary. The community itself was a mix of old-timers who valued their privacy and a newer wave of residents, attracted by the manicured lawns a few streets over. And that's where the Rolling Hills HOA came in. When I bought the place, the HOA was a minor footnote, a $50 a year fee for maintaining the community entrance sign. It was run by a few retired volunteers, and meetings were brief, friendly affairs. But then, Eleanor Vance moved in. She was elected HOA president on a platform of increased property values and community standards. Suddenly, the benign organization had teeth. Newsletters started arriving, filled with new regulations. Approved paint colors, mandatory lawn cutting frequencies, and rules about unsightly decorations. A subtle shift occurred. The friendly waves were replaced with scrutinizing glances. The community entrance sign got a pricey upgrade, and our fees quietly doubled. I tried to stay out of it. My cabin, with its wildflowers and the naturally messy creek bank, was an island in a sea of increasingly identical, perfectly green lawns. I didn't realize it yet, but my little slice of paradise had just become a target. The first official notice arrived on a Tuesday. It wasn't about my lawn or my paint. It was about the creek. They called it a significant erosion and safety hazard. The piece I had worked so hard to build was about to be shattered, not by a natural disaster, but by a piece of paper signed by my new HOA president. The first notice was a masterclass in bureaucratic language. It cited a vague Article 14, Section B of the HOA bylaws, concerning landscape maintenance and hazard mitigation. My creek, the document claimed, posed an unacceptable risk of soil erosion and a potential attractive nuisance to children. The solution demanded was both extreme and specific. I was to install permanent, engineered retaining walls and channel lining along the entire stretch of the creek on my property. My heart sank. I wasn't an engineer, but I knew the cost of such a project would be astronomical, easily stretching into the tens of thousands of dollars. A financial death sentence. This wasn't a request for maintenance. It was an impossible demand designed to force compliance through bankruptcy. I did my homework. I contacted a local environmental biologist who, for a small fee, wrote a letter stating that the creek was a stable, spring-fed waterway, that its gentle banks were not eroding, and that its natural state was ecologically beneficial. I presented this at the next HOA meeting, my voice steady but my hands trembling slightly. Eleanor Vance presided over the meeting from a raised dais that had never been there before. She listened to my defense with a placid, almost bored expression. When I finished, she adjusted her microphone. "Thank you for that opinion, Alex," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "However, the board relies on professional assessments. Our primary concern is the uniform safety and value of every property in Rolling Hills. Your rustic setup might be acceptable to you, but it negatively impacts your neighbors." I looked around the room. My immediate neighbors, the Millers, an elderly couple who often enjoyed the view of the creek from my land, shifted uncomfortably in their seats but said nothing. The silence from the rest of the board members was deafening. They were a panel of stone-faced statues, and Eleanor was their sculptor. The following week, a second notice arrived, this one including a fine of $500 for non-compliance. A line had been crossed. This was no longer a dispute. It was a shakedown. I refused to pay. 2 weeks later, another fine arrived, this one for $1,000, citing accumulating violations. The letters became a regular feature in my mailbox, a torrent of financial threats. $1,500 for creating a vermin habitat. $2,000 for unauthorized alteration of natural drainage. The accusations grew more absurd, the fines more punitive. I tried to fight back within their system. I filed a formal appeal. It was denied in a pre-stamped letter without a hearing. I requested a copy of the engineering report that had justified their initial demand. They provided a single-page document from a firm no one had ever heard of, filled with technical jargon but no real data, essentially a $5,000 invoice for a predetermined conclusion. It was a kangaroo court, and I was the defendant, judge, and executioner all rolled into one. The psychological warfare began. My trash cans were tagged for being improperly stored an hour after pickup. My dog was reported for excessive barking, a feat impossible for my ancient, nearly deaf Labrador. One Saturday, I found Eleanor herself standing at the edge of my property line, a clipboard in hand, taking pictures of the creek. "Just documenting the ongoing violation, Alex," she called out, her smile not reaching her eyes. "The board needs a visual record of the deterioration." The final, chilling escalation came not from the HOA, but from the city. A code enforcement officer showed up at my door. He was a weary-looking man who seemed embarrassed by his own presence. He held a complaint, filed anonymously, alleging that my property was creating a water runoff issue that was flooding adjacent lots. "This is ridiculous," I told him, my frustration boiling over. "The creek flows from the HOA's common land through my property and downstream. I'm the last one who would have a runoff problem." The officer sighed, nodding. "I know. I can see the topography. But a formal complaint has been filed. I have to investigate." As he was leaving, he turned back, lowering his voice. "Look, son, whoever filed this is playing hardball. They're trying to get the city to force you to do what the HOA can't. You need a lawyer. A good one." It was the confirmation I needed. This was a multi-front war, and Eleanor was using every weapon in her arsenal. The stress was becoming a physical presence in my life. I stopped sleeping. The gentle babble of the creek, once a source of comfort, now sounded like a countdown to financial ruin. My sanctuary had become a prison of anxiety. The climax of their campaign arrived on a crisp, sunny morning. I woke up to the sound of roaring diesel engines. Peering through my blinds, I felt a jolt of pure adrenaline. A massive yellow bulldozer and a cement mixer truck were rumbling down the community road, followed by Eleanor's pristine white SUV. They weren't heading for the community park. They were lining up on the HOA's common land, right at the head of the creek, just upstream from my property line. I threw on my clothes and ran outside. Eleanor was already there, directing the crew with the authority of a general. "Eleanor, what is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and panic. She turned to me, that same cold, placid smile on her face. "The board has voted to take matters into its own hands, Alex. Since you have refused to secure your section of the creek, we are mitigating the hazard at the source. We are consolidating and stabilizing the bank on association property for the good of the community." And then she said the words that would echo in my mind for weeks, a sentence so dripping with malicious glee it revealed her entire hand. "We're going to channel the water flow permanently." I watched, utterly helpless, as the bulldozer crunched forward. It wasn't building a retaining wall. It was pushing a mountain of dirt and gravel into the creek's source, the very spring that fed it. And behind it, the cement mixer's churn began to rotate, ready to pour a permanent, artificial plug over the heart of my creek. This was no engineering solution. It was an execution. They weren't just trying to find me into submission anymore. They were killing the creek to prove a point. And in that moment, as the first stream of wet, gray cement slithered from the truck's chute, smothering the land, I knew this was no longer about rules or fines. This was about vengeance. And a cold, hard certainty settled in my stomach. They had no idea what they had just done. The following weeks were a strange, silent purgatory. The visual evidence of their act was a scar on the land, a grotesque, gray slab of cement where the spring once bubbled freely. My creek was gone. A few stagnant puddles were all that remained, slowly being absorbed by the thirsty earth. The silence was the worst part. The absence of the water's gentle murmur was a constant, screaming reminder of what had been stolen. The wildlife had vanished. My property, once vibrant and alive, felt like it was holding its breath, dying slowly. My lawyer, a sharp, relentless woman named Sarah Jenkins, had been working tirelessly. We had a strong case for trespass and property damage, but we were playing in the HOA's sandbox of bylaws and committees. It felt like trying to fight a hydra. Cut off one head, and two more would grow back with new fines, new violations. Eleanor's smug confidence was a fortress, and we were throwing pebbles at its walls. Then the phone call came. It was from a man named David, who identified himself as the county water resource manager. His voice was grim, laced with an urgency that made my heart skip a beat. "Mr. Alex, we've had a formal complaint from multiple residents in the Rolling Hills community," he said. "They're reporting a complete loss of water pressure, and some wells are running dry. Our initial investigation points to a catastrophic blockage in the primary aquifer-fed spring that feeds their shared well system." He paused, and I could hear the rustling of papers. "Our maps show that spring is located on the HOA's common land, right at the coordinates where you reported an unauthorized cement pour. We're sending a team out there right now with ground-penetrating radar. We need to know exactly what they did." A cold, hard wave of understanding washed over me. The spring they had plugged wasn't just the source of my creek. It was the same underground source that fed the porous rock of the aquifer, the very same aquifer that filled the community's shared well. They hadn't just destroyed a creek. They had literally cemented over their own water supply. I didn't feel joy in that moment. I felt a profound, terrifying sense of justice. This was no longer a neighborhood dispute. It was an environmental and public health disaster, entirely self-inflicted. The showdown happened 2 days later. The HOA, in a desperate attempt to control the narrative and find a scapegoat, called an emergency meeting. The community hall was packed, buzzing with a frantic, anxious energy. People weren't concerned with my creek anymore. They were terrified about their taps running dry. Eleanor stood at the podium, her usual composure cracked. She tried to project calm authority, but a faint tremor was visible in her hands. "Homeowners, please, remain calm. We are dealing with a temporary geological event. The board is exploring all options to—" I didn't wait for an invitation. I stood up from my seat in the back, the motion cutting through her speech. Every head in the room turned to look at me. "Exploring options, Eleanor?" I said, my voice clear and steady, carrying across the silent room. "Are you exploring how to unpour several tons of cement?" A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's eyes widened, then narrowed. "This is not the time for your baseless accusations, Alex. Your continued harassment of this board. It's not an accusation. It's a fact," I interrupted, holding up a thick manila envelope. "I have here the preliminary report from the County Water Resource Department. It concludes, and I quote, "The unauthorized and unpermitted cement obstruction of the Rolling Hill Spring has directly caused a critical failure of the local aquifer's recharge capacity, leading to the well failure." The murmurs erupted into shouts of alarm and anger. "You see," I continued, walking slowly down the center aisle, "when you decided to stabilize the landscape to get at me, you never bothered to check where the water actually came from. You were so focused on your petty power trip, on burying my creek, that you didn't realize you were pouring concrete down your own throat." I stopped at the front, turning to face the crowd of my neighbors, their faces a mosaic of shock and dawning rage. "That hazard you were so worried about was the very thing that gave every single one of you water. You didn't just kill my creek, Eleanor. You killed the community's well." The room exploded. People were on their feet, yelling, shaking their fists at the board. Eleanor stood frozen at the podium, her face a ghostly white, her mouth slightly agape. The fortress of her confidence was crumbling into dust under the weight of her own catastrophic error. It was in that moment of beautiful, chaotic justice that the double doors at the back of the hall swung open with a loud thud. Two men in sharp, official-looking suits walked in, followed by David, the water resource manager. They moved with a purpose that silenced the room once more. One of the suits stepped forward, holding up a badge and a formal document. "Eleanor Vance? I'm with the State Department of Environmental Quality. This is a cease and desist order and a notice of intent to fine the Rolling Hills Homeowners Association for the unpermitted alteration of a protected water source and the willful destruction of a critical wetland habitat." He placed the document on the podium in front of her. "The fines, Ms. Vance, are substantial. They are calculated per gallon of water flow disrupted per day until the site is fully restored to its original state. We estimate the initial penalty to be in the high six figures." The other suit spoke, his voice colder, more dangerous. "And ma'am, I'm a special agent with the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division. We are opening a formal inquiry into potential violations of the Clean Water Act. We will need to speak with you and every member of this board immediately." The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than any concrete. You could have heard a pin drop. Eleanor Vance, the HOA president who had ruled with an iron fist, who had sent fines and threats with impunity, simply sank into her chair. The clipboard she always carried clattered to the floor. The look on her face wasn't just defeat. It was the utter annihilation of her entire world. She had tried to bury me in paperwork and fines, and in return, the full weight of the federal government was about to bury her. I looked at the stunned faces of the board members, at the agents standing over Eleanor, and I finally allowed myself a single, deep breath. The battle was over. In the days and weeks that followed the explosive HOA meeting, the world of Rolling Hills turned upside down. The state of shock gave way to a frantic, collective effort to survive. The county had to truck in potable water for the residents, a humiliating and costly reminder of the board's folly that played out on the local news. The story, HOA boards over nature, neighborhood left high and dry, was a brief but deeply embarrassing blip on the regional radar, cementing Rolling Hills as a cautionary tale. The legal and financial dominoes began to fall with a satisfying, decisive finality. Eleanor Vance was immediately forced to resign from the HOA board. The sheer scale of the state and federal fines, initially totaling over $750,000, meant the association's insurance wouldn't cover the willful, illegal act. Every homeowner in Rolling Hills faced a special assessment, a massive bill to pay for the very disaster their board had created. The outrage was palpable. The same neighbors who had remained silent during my persecution were now screaming for blood, their anger redirected from their dry taps to the people who caused it. But the financial pain was only the beginning. The EPA's mandate was non-negotiable: full ecological restoration. The cementectomy, as the crew came to call it, was a monumental task. For weeks, the silence was broken not by the gentle flow of water, but by the grating whine of diamond-tipped concrete saws and the thunder of jackhammers. I would sit on my stone bench and watch as they carefully, painstakingly, broke apart the gray tomb Eleanor had built. It was a slow, expensive, and deeply symbolic deconstruction of her authority. The day they broke through to the spring was one I will never forget. There was no dramatic geyser, just a slow, muddy seepage at first. But as the workers cleared more of the debris, the water began to find its old path, trickling tentatively over the rocks, rediscovering its way. It was a faint echo of its former self, but it was alive. The land itself seemed to let out a sigh of relief. Over the following months, with the help of the environmental biologist I'd hired earlier, we oversaw the replanting of native vegetation along the banks. The creek bed, scarred but resilient, began to heal. The personal consequences for Eleanor and her most loyal board members were severe. They were sued individually by a coalition of angry homeowners to recover the cost of the special assessment. The legal fees bankrupted them. Eleanor's house, the one with the perfectly manicured lawn, went into foreclosure. She moved away a few months later, her name becoming a whispered curse in the community she had sought to absolutely control. The petty tyrant was ultimately defeated not by a heroic lawyer, but by the immutable laws of hydrology and her own staggering hubris. A new, reformed HOA board was elected by a landslide. Their first official act was to formally apologize to me and to repeal a slew of the most oppressive bylaws Eleanor had enacted. The second was to pass a permanent resolution protecting the creek and the natural wetland area, ensuring no board could ever make such a short-sighted mistake again. The focus shifted from uniformity to community, from controlling nature to coexisting with it. My life slowly returned to a new normal. The constant, gnawing anxiety lifted. The fines were wiped from my record, and the HOA even reimbursed me for the legal fees I had incurred fighting them. The creek's song returned, gradually growing from a whisper back to its familiar, comforting babble. The wildlife followed. The songbirds were the first to return, then the frogs, and one morning, I saw the familiar tracks of a deer in the soft mud of the bank. The balance had been restored, but I was not the same person. The man who had just wanted to be left alone in his peaceful cabin was gone. In his place was someone who understood that systems of power, no matter how small, must be watched. That a signature on a ballot or a voice in a meeting is not a trivial thing. I had learned that the price of peace is often vigilance. I often think back to that final, triumphant moment in the community hall. It wasn't my words that defeated Eleanor Vance. It was the truth. I had simply been the one to hold up the mirror. Her empire, built on petty rules and the fear of her neighbors, was washed away by the very element she tried to control. So, the next time you get a notice from your HOA or your neighborhood busybody, a citation about your grass being half an inch too long or your fence being the wrong shade of beige, remember this story. Remember that the power they have is only the power you are willing to cede. These battles often seem small, but they are about something much larger than property values. They are about the fundamental right to the peaceful enjoyment of your own home. They are about the principle of the thing. And sometimes the most powerful weapon you have isn't a lawyer or a loud voice. Sometimes it's simply a creek, waiting patiently to remind everyone of the natural order of things. Because you can fine a person, you can intimidate a neighbor, but you cannot, try as you might, sue a river. And you can never, ever win a fight against the water.